We're absolutely delighted today to welcome Jenny Hocking, who needs no introduction, is our distinguished biographer of the Whitlam years, Harris letters. I was one of Jenny's most disappointing students, so I'm very pleased that she's agreed to be here today. I haven't been here for a long time, but we're very, very grateful to be here. Of course, it is 50 years since the election of the Whitlam Government, or it was about a month ago. And Jenny, being the preeminent scholar of those years here in Australia, we're just thrilled that she was able to find the time to join us today. Please make her very welcome.
Thanks very much, Emma. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to thank Emma Dawson, wonderful former student, and Per Capita for asking me to speak today at the John Cain Luncheon Series. It's really a great honour and a pleasure. I just welcomed the Honourable Brian Howe and Renata Howe and distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. As Emma said, I've written a great deal about Gough Whitlam, the Whitlam Government, and the dismissal of the Whitlam Government in particular. But today I don't want to speak about the latter, although I'm very happy to take questions on that if you wish. You never know, perhaps I'll come back another time and speak about the dismissal. But at this time of the 50th anniversary of Whitlam's election, I did want to focus on that point of change in our history. After 23 years, I think it's a time that we don't often reflect upon enough, just how difficult it was for Labor to come into office and why the elation that's often described about December 1972 is just that, a moment of elation. Gough Whitlam came to Parliament as the new member for Werra in 1952 in a by-election. He was 36 years old, a returned Air Force navigator with 4.5 years active service in the Pacific, a barrister with a young family living in Cronulla. That was the sprawling post-war suburban growth corridor of southern Sydney. He was already something of a local political identity, having unsuccessfully contested the Sutherland Shire Council and the New South Wales state elections. As he said, I could have become Lord Mayor of Sydney, President of the Sutherland Shire, or Premier of New South Wales. But instead I settled for Prime Minister. Above all, he was an energetic new MP, full of ideas and eager for change. And he fully expected that the Labor Party would soon be back in office. After all, it had only been 3 years since Chifley had lost the 1949 election to Robert Menzies' newly ascendant Liberal Party. Gough Whitlam could never have anticipated the 2 decades of dire opposition that lay before him and the Labor Party as it became lost in the bitter aftermath of the 1955 split. It's a testament to the capacity of Labor to survive through that period of deep division. Graham Freudenberg later said, Whitlam taught us how not to split in coming to office. And also Whitlam's own determination that they endured those 2 decades in fractious opposition to form government in 1972. Today I'll take us on that tortuous journey, from opposition to government, from electoral despair, through rebuilding a party platform that had become irrelevant to contemporary needs and ultimately to government. The essential task was to restore the Labor Party contemporary relevance. That was one of Whitlam's favourite phrases in relation to Labor, contemporary relevance, comrade, he would say. Or as John Faulkner put it, to make Labor not just electable, but worth electing. In this anniversary year, as we examine the beginnings of the Whitlam government, we're reminded once again of the depth of that policy development that he drove, with many others, inside and outside the Labor Party, and its extensive preparations for the transition to government and implementation of the platform. The extent of that work of renewal is simply remarkable to look at today. And yet that period of pre-government is too often overlooked in what's become an endless focus on the vice-regal demise of the government, the infamous dismissal. And I've probably played a bit of a part in that as well. For too long, we have read the Whitlam government backwards, through the prism of its dismissal, and it's a fundamental distortion. The irresistible drama of that singular event with an operatic arc, a political promise and dashed hope has consumed so much of the historical focus that it's all but eclipsed the decade-long years of recovery and renewal which preceded it. And that's what I want to talk about today, because that's the crucible for everything that followed. The strong reformist agenda, the commitment to the electoral mandate, which led to Whitlam's rapid pace of change once he came to government. And that period in opposition is also, I think, an exemplar of the constructive use of opposition for a party renewal, for a party to rebuild, reflect, debate and advance new policy positions. And so there are clear lessons in Labor's resurrection under Whitlam for the current electoral woes of the Liberal Party. But I just don't imagine that that's a source they'd like to be exploring. But if they did, I think they would see that if it doesn't rebuild, if it doesn't reflect and make a new journey of renewal, they're at risk, I think, of splintering and possibly ending altogether. And for a time, it looked like the Labor Party might do that as well, during the 1950s in particular. So, the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam election provides a welcome opportunity for what I think is a necessary historical corrective by refocusing not on the final months of the government and its dramatic denouement, but on how that government came to be. And looked at in this way, there's a rare continuity in Whitlam's own political trajectory, which actually stretches back even to his childhood in Canberra. And if you see my biography of Gough Whitlam, you'll know that's a particular theme of the early years. And I'd like to say just a few words about that background, because this is where the consistent threads in Whitlam's own life, political life, began. His childhood in Canberra as the newly developing national capital was taking shape from 1927. They moved there when his father became Deputy Crown Solicitor, was a really lasting critical influence. His war service in the Pacific and interactions with Indigenous peoples of Gough and Whitlam while they were stationed there drove a long-standing commitment to Indigenous rights, and also an appreciation of changing political dynamics in our region. In Whitlam's own typically modest assessment, he said, that gave me an insight which nobody else in the Parliament had as well. And the final point was the failure of the Curtin government's 1944 referendum on post-war reconstruction and democratic rights, for which Whitlam had campaigned strongly and which he harboured as unfinished Labor business. That cemented a determination, he said, to do all I could to modernise the Australian Constitution. So there's a complex interplay here between Whitlam's own background, the political renewal of the 1960s, constitutional innovation, which he did drive, and years of parliamentary agitation. Whitlam pursued the Menzies government over these issues ever since he arrived in Parliament. In 1954, he spoke in support of recognising Communist China and admitting China to the UN. He urged independence for Papua New Guinea and excoriated Menzies for failing to address equal pay for women in the Commonwealth Public Service or to repeal the discriminatory provisions of Section 127 of the Constitution. All of those things relating to equal pay, PNG, etc., he did, of course, once in government. But Labor's electoral desert into the 1960s was twofold. First, within the Labor Party itself, and the intractable divisions reflected in and cemented by the split. And secondly, the ascent of the Liberal Party under Menzies, which had galvanised the Conservative forces and left Labor struggling to adapt to changing post-war politics. The shock and the bitterness of the split, together with the later formation of the fiercely anti-Labor Democratic Labor Party, the DLP, with the stated electoral purpose of keeping the Labor Party out of office, caused untold political damage. At the inaugural meeting of the DLP in 1956, a young Sydney barrister and leading grouper lawyer, John Kerr, was invited to be its inaugural leader. Kerr declined, and he saved his role for another time. And it's extraordinary that Whitlam appears to have been unaware of that intense political engagement of Kerr in the 1950s, which Lionel Murphy, Whitlam's Attorney General, was more than well aware of, but that's another story. After the split, Whitlam said the party stagnated and the platform was stultified. Labor became electorally unviable, locked in the past and fearful of change. The party became obsessed, he said, not with renewal for the future, but with a return to a comfortable past, not renovation, but mere restoration. And his speech is always peppered with those sort of linked phrases which are marvellous to read. If it were to survive as a party of government, Whitlam said, a party fit for office, the Labor Party had to adapt, had to rebuild with a modern policy agenda relevant to contemporary needs. But there's another aspect in Whitlam's drive to policy reform, without which it simply could not have succeeded. And that was his intellectual shift from what was a traditional pessimism of many in the Labor Party at that time, understandably, who saw the Constitution only as a barrier to reform. And this was expressed by Whitlam himself really strongly in his 1957 lecture, The Constitution versus Labor. Whitlam described the Constitution then as enshrining Liberal policy and banning Labor policy. And that was a very common view, and it was a really damaging view because it dampened enthusiasm for change. You know, how can we reform when it's just going to be defeated at the High Court? But within a few years, Whitlam's view had changed completely and utterly. And there's one reason for that, and it was his membership of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Review. Now, that probably doesn't sound very exciting, but for Whitlam, this was transformative. He was invited to be one of the Labor Party members on that committee by Robert Menzies, who perhaps didn't realise what the relatively young member was going to get out of this membership of it. But he left that committee 4 years later, absolutely determined that the Labor Party could effect radical change, radical reform within the bounds of the Constitution. It was tremendously important. And he describes that as one of the three key influences on his life. And he had a rare optimism after that 4 years on the committee. He said, I went from the despair of Section 92 to the confidence of Section 96. 92 was the barrier, 96 was the avenue. It was the avenue to change through using tithe grants in particular in ways that had never been anticipated before, but not only that, using international conventions and so on to pass domestic laws, all of which have been now part of our political furniture. But most importantly, in terms of what was happening within the Labor Party, the push for modernisation, the Constitution could no longer be what Whitlam called an alibi for the party's failure to develop a viable constitutionally compliant reform agenda, which had become the case. With Whitlam's election as deputy leader in 1960, the push for modernisation accelerated, and I think Frank Bongiorno probably spoke to you a little bit about this last month. With Arthur Calwell as party leader, the new leadership team was an uneasy mix of the old and the new. At 43 years of age, not particularly young, but Whitlam was Labor's youngest deputy leader in more than 40 years. And Calwell, who was a generation older, was a dedicated adherent of the White Australia policy, which Whitlam abhorred and was determined to change, and an equally resplendent opponent of state aid for non-government schools, two of the great policy schisms during their leadership. Whitlam appointed a young economist and noble Fabian John Menadue as his private secretary, and he began to develop a really strong team around him that lasted 2 years. Carol Summerhayes, who's a wonderful person that was in Whitlam's office for many years, his private secretary Richard Hall, and the incomparable speechwriter Graham Freudenberg made a very pointed gesture by jumping ship from Paul's office to Whitlam's when Whitlam became leader in 1967. And another leading Fabian, the wonderful Race Matthews, joined his staff following Menadue's departure. It was Menadue who captured the three-step path from party reform to election victory in the pithy catch-cry party policy people. This Fabian evidence-based approach to policy development suited Whitlam's belief in the use of forensic arguments supported by detailed empirical research to drive good policy bang. And it also generated a bank of policy ideas, which fed later into government very usefully. His speeches were long, they were packed full of data, facts and figures, that Graham Freudenberg always tried to urge him to take out, that they were assembled with a barrister's intent to make an unassailable argument of the need for reform. And his maiden speech in 1953, which focused on the need for basic infrastructure, roads, services, sewerage even, in his seat of wherever, was a really arresting example of that dialectic method. Whitlam's battles within the Labor Party, I won't go into them all, I don't have time, over policy renewal and party reform were legion. In this period of intense division and rupture, he survived an attempt to expel him from the party in 1966, then barely survived his own abrupt resignation of leader in 1968. He oversaw the federal intervention into the Victorian branch in 1970 before finally taking the Labor Party to government in 1972. It was just the most extraordinary journey, which of course is in my biography of Whitlam. But in that protracted process of party renewal and the key conferences that began that process of passing many policy shifts, the real pivotal year was 1969. It was a high point of policy reform with a raft of new policy commitments at the National Conference, from the Vietnam War, urban development, state aid, education, electoral equity, the White Australia policy, and Indigenous affairs. Many of those had begun much earlier in the 65 and 67 conference, but they were firmed up in 69, and that became the platform that then went to the election in 69, 67, and 72. 69 was also the year that Whitlam fought his first election as leader and the first for the Labor Party with this comprehensive reform agenda. And the election results in October that year were just a stunning turnaround for Labor. Labor gained 18 seats, a 7% swing, and despite securing over 50% of the two-party preferred vote, it still fell short of victory by 4 seats. The following year, in 71, John Gordon was succeeded as Liberal leader and Prime Minister by Sir William Billy McMahon. And the churn of Liberal leaders since Menzies was making the Labor Party look like a paragon of stability. The Sydney Morning Herald then described Whitlam as certain future Australian Prime Minister, but of course there was never anything certain about it for Labor to come to office. And Whitlam never believed that until it actually happened in 1972. One of the reasons for that is the significant rural gerrymander, something that's often forgotten in the history of that time. Because Whitlam's electoral reforms, which instituted one vote, one value, were not introduced and passed until 1974. But in the 1960s, that rural weighting, as it was very politely called, gifted coalition-held electorates in rural areas with as few as half the voter population of inner-city Labor-held seats. For its great beneficiary, the Country Party, it was the electoral equivalent of 2 for the price of 1, and that created a real structural obstacle to Labor coming into office. That had an impact, obviously. But there was a discernible shift in the public reception of both Whitlam and the Labor Party, particularly after Whitlam's 1971 visit to China. His decision to head an ALP delegation to Communist China was audacious and politically fraught, and Freudenberg urged him not to go. With an election the following year, he said it's courting disaster to appear soft on communism, which of course how that was depicted by the government. But Whitlam was always going to go. This was an historic opportunity to enter the world stage, which was then at a tipping point in international relations, which Whitlam had discerned and McMahon had not. As Whitlam met Premier Zhou Enlai, McMahon mocked him as the Manchurian candidate, and I think we saw that recycled very recently in our recent election, which just shows how very out of date the Liberals were, because this was used by McMahon 50 years ago, accusing him of damaging Australia's relations with our most important ally, America. Well, unfortunately for McMahon, our most important ally hadn't even bothered to tell the Australian Prime Minister of a tectonic shift in US-China relations that was then well underway. And McMahon learned too late that the US Secretary of State Kissinger was arriving in Beijing to arrange President Nixon's own historic trip to China just as Gough Whitlam was leaving. So for Whitlam and the Labor Party, this 1971 China trip was a personal and political triumph. For McMahon, it was a complete humiliation. Whitlam returned to Australia seen as the harbinger of change, with the McMahon government looking jaded and out of touch. It was also a turning point for Labor, the point at which it shifted from a party of opposition to a viable party of government, which was already driving policy from opposition. And it presaged an electoral disaster for the McMahon government on the 2nd of December 1972. The famous It's Time election campaign, which was run at that time, was the best and most professional political campaign the Labor Party had ever run. And it's widely seen as the birth of professional political campaigning in Australia. It was an integrated multimedia campaign linked across all media and each looping back to that central theme, it's time. Even today, 50 years later, those two words, it's time, still signify Gough Whitlam's 1972 election victory. Its most identifiable element was an anthemic theme song, It's Time, of course, sung by blues singer Alison McCallum. And it's sort of surreal to hear that, to hear strains of policy set to music with a rousing chorus of prominent identities in the arts. It's Time perfectly captured the electoral mood for change, and it worked. How many other campaign slogans and campaign songs are still remembered 50 years later? Not many, I would say. And like Whitlam's reform agenda, the 1972 campaign also drew on extensive research and detailed planning. It used focus groups for the first time and even road tested a mini campaign, which was run the previous year, to test the reception of the leaders. Whitlam was found to be aloof, removed, too reserved, and they suggested changing his hairstyle. Their wives, and Margaret was found to be very, very well received, to be warm, engaging, and they said, make more use of Margaret. Even individual policies were road tested, much more like the campaigns we run today. Nothing was left to chance. And this is important. The Labor Party never assumed that 1972 was always theirs for the taking. And that magnificent It's Time policy speech, which is still a marvel to read in political campaign speeches, was delivered in November 1972 in Blacktown Civic Centre before an enormous adoring crowd. It was the culmination of that decade of policy work that had come before. It presented a sweeping reform agenda with over 200 individual commitments, synthesised into an expansive blueprint for modern Australia known as the Program. Whitlam acknowledged the breadth of those commitments and said after 23 years of Conservative government, it has to be so. It should be so because the backlog is so great. The three great aims of the program were to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. And at its heart was equality of opportunity. The key to this was education, Whitlam said, based on a student's merit rather than a parent's wealth. And it's interesting that this had been his own family's pathway to politics and the law, from what not many people seem to know about, which is the adolescent criminality of Whitlam's grandfather, located in the Victorian Public Records Office, to his father as Commonwealth Crown Solicitor in just one generation. And when I informed Whitlam of this there he is, grandfather the felon. I informed Whitlam of this unfortunate background to his grandfather. He thought about that for a while and said, well, it just goes to show you my family went in one generation from one side of the law to the other. And he said it just goes to show the benefit of a good education system, which is, you know, his family was not the silver tail that is often predicted, far from it. In contrast to what was this extraordinary aspirational pitch of that election campaign, Billy McMahon delivered an anodyne speech from behind a studio desk. And Labor's catchy It's Time slogan was everything that the Liberal Party's prosaic response, not yet, was not. What a terrible campaign slogan, not yet, which was only made worse by these dreadful coalition advertisements, which showed Whitlam taking off a mask to reveal Bob Hawke, because much of the Liberals' campaign was around fear of communism, fear of unions, fear of workers. It was really a shockingly bad campaign. Labor responded to those advertisements with their own advertisements showing Billy McMahon taking off a mask to reveal Billy McMahon. So, on the 2nd of December 1972, Whitlam, as we know, led the Labor Party to victory with 52.7% of the vote, a 2.5% swing and a margin of 9 seats. In his first speech as Prime Minister-elect, from a makeshift scaffolding in the backyard of the Whitlam's Albert Street Cover Manor home, where election night party was in full swing and absolutely packed, Whitlam said the government will have a mandate from the people to carry out all its programs. 2 important things in that first speech: mandate, absolutely central to Whitlam's thinking. I don't have time to talk about today. The mandate was central, and to carry out all its programs, which of course he set out to do. He said, I don't see the election victory as just a permit to preside, but it is a command to perform. And there's a very, very important notion in Whitlam's determination to pass everything in that program. And so it should be no surprise to see the immediacy and speed with which Whitlam moved. One of the things that is really interesting is that the day after the election, Whitlam went straight to Canberra. Barely 12 hours later, he set the machinery for a transfer of power in place. And the head of the Prime Minister's Department, John Bunting, his papers are in the National Archives. They're not normally the most interesting papers, but they are very, very interesting in these early days of the Whitlam government because they show how closely Whitlam was across everything that happened, but also how important the revised Labor Party platform was to what then was put in place. There's actually copies of each of the 1969, 1972 and 1971 ALP platform publications in Bunting's files. That's how closely they were mirrored. And of course, as you would know, the full ministry could not be elected possibly until after Christmas because the caucus could not be assembled until the votes were all counted. But what is fascinating in the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck's notes, Hasluck was a former journalist. He kept wonderful pen portraits, some of them quite scurrilous, of all of his colleagues in Canberra, many other Canberra identities. And there's a fascinating description of his 2 most critical conversations the day after the election. First with Billy McMahon, who fully expected to stay in office until Labor elected the full caucus and the full ministry, which might be the following year, because it was Christmas coming up. And McMahon thought he would just stay on. And Hasluck, who was, of course, no friend of McMahon's, like many others in Canberra at the time, agreed to nothing and simply said, well, I'll think about this. Whitlam then came to see him. And what's fascinating is that Hasluck writes, it became apparent that weeks before polling day, Whitlam had already worked out the expedient of having an interim government of 2 ministers. So he'd already worked out that there would be a duumvirate weeks before the final election results. Hasluck agreed, and as we know, on the 5th of December, Whitlam and his deputy Lance Barnard were sworn in to all 27 ministries between them. And no, it's not the same as what Scott Morrison has just done, as I keep telling people on Twitter. But what it can be seen as a precursor to, and nobody seems to really pick this up, is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's own interim ministry, I think it was of 5, immediately after the election. And again, both were administrative means of enabling the rapid formation of a new Labor government, while some seats remained in doubt. And we can just have a quick look, because I love some of these pictures, so I've just got them up there. We can go back later if you like. But these are just, look, that's just a few of the duumvirate's extraordinary decisions. They made 40 really important decisions in the first 2 weeks, in its 2 weeks of existence, and it began with a really important one, which was the immediate release of young men from prison for refusing to serve in the Vietnam War. It's extraordinary to think that young men who were too young to vote, but old enough to go to Vietnam, had been put in prison for refusing to go. The end of conscription and the withdrawal of remaining forces and others, as you can see. But what's important is that every one of the duumvirate's 40 decisions was based on a clear policy commitment in the ALP platform and the policy speech. Freudenberg called it the apotheosis of the mandate. In those 2 weeks, the familiar landscape of post-war Australian politics had already changed irrevocably, and Whitlam began the next stage in his political career as Australia's 21st Prime Minister and leader of the most successful reformist government in our history. In conclusion, we're often asked what reforms were passed. You may have noticed in recent weeks, a flurry of articles, largely from the Australian pages, saying, yes, Whitlam did some things, he did some pretty good reforms, but he did too much too soon. There was too much done. He was bad on implementation, great ideas, just couldn't get the detail right. And we need to ask, well, what was actually done by the government? You know, it makes it sound as though, sure, they have fantastic policies, hundreds of them, but actually achieved little. Oops. If you see here, the Whitlam government introduced a record number of bills during its lifetime of 3 years, not forgetting the all-important 1974 dissolution election when Whitlam was re-elected. How many histories forget that important fact? So more than at any other time in our history, this number of bills was put forward over those 3 years. 254 bills in 73, 229 in 1974, etc. The previous largest had been 169 in 1968, so it's a huge jump. In total, 507 bills were passed, a record number over the 3 years of the Whitlam government. And Whitlam himself says that he estimates about 2/3 of the reform program was actually put in place. So much for being light on detail and implementation. And I would say much of that is due to the hard work that went into the policy development, much of which contained the means of implementation within it. What's really important here is equally the record number of bills rejected by the Senate. That's far more important in many ways than Whitlam's own capacity to pass bills through the Senate, because this is an unprecedented extent of obstruction. It was the Senate rejected in those 3 years more bills, that is 93 bills, than the Senate had rejected in the entire previous 71 years put together. I mean, that is absolutely extraordinary. It had previously rejected only 68 bills in the entire previous 71 years. In Gavin Souter's very detailed book, he describes that process. In conclusion, despite that extraordinary obstruction, Whitlam's grand vision of Labor reforms as constitutionally achievable and politically relevant, as popular and enduring, has proved to be exactly that. So much of the hard-fought program for change was implemented against entrenched opposition and has endured. From free tertiary education, that unfortunately did not endure, to equal pay, no-fault divorce, votes for 18-year-olds, an independent foreign policy stance, universal health insurance, ending the White Australia policy, multiculturalism, Indigenous land rights, and the Racial Discrimination Act, without which the Mabo case could not have succeeded, due to Mabo number 1 for all you legal buffs. And these reforms, as Whitlam said, remain, like all great Labor legislation, permanent landmarks in our history. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Jenny. This is the point in the luncheon where we get a very enthusiastic response from our audience, and I imagine more so than ever today. Thank you for that wonderful reflection on the Whitlam years. I'll open by saying my family arrived from the UK in 1974, and my parents have often said that if it had been 3 years either side, they would have turned tail. But they landed in the early years of the Whitlam government and got quite caught up in what it meant to be in Australia at that time. Jenny's happy to take some questions or have a conversation. Who would like to kick us off?
Hello, I'm a Pontu from way back, and I arrived well after Whitlam, so I'm only vaguely aware. Number one, he was very innovative. Number two, he was charismatic. Do those things go together, or can they be mutually exclusive?
That's a very interesting question. I'll better repeat. The question was whether being charismatic and being very innovative, as Whitlam was, rightly, both necessarily go together. I think what possibly goes together is being charismatic in the sense of being able to lead the change that innovation allows us to see is possible. Whitlam was a leader. You know, he was an exceptional leader, and he brought people with him because of his charisma, but also because he saw solutions, like his solution constitutionally to some of the reforms that many in the Labor Party felt could not be effected under the bounds of the Constitution, was transformative, but also it was optimistic. It generated a sense of optimism when previously there had been enormous pessimism, both about whether Labor could come back into office and whether it could actually make meaningful reforms, particularly after the bank nationalisation case. So it was important, but I don't think they necessarily have to go together. I think that very much depends on what the times demand. Whitlam was, I think, the first leader able to take really strong advantage of television. He used that medium extremely well, and McMahon, partly because he had a hearing issue and he did not perform well on television interviews or could not use the teleprompter well, he lacked totally all of the things that Whitlam could bring to a television interview. Whitlam had been, as I think I've got a scan here of Whitlam, playing Prime Minister in the Sydney University Dramatic Society. So, you know, he was experienced as a media performer long before he came to office. And that charisma, I think, did carry his party, and it also carried his popularity, both in 1972 and 1974. But ultimately, you know, political circumstances took over. But I think his leadership was absolutely central to the carriage of change within the Labor Party. I mean, there were many, many others involved. I mean, Don Dunstan was central over the One Australia policy, the modernisers, as they were called, and later the participants in Victoria. Absolutely crucial to have a range of people and experts from outside the party as well to advise. And that use of others was something Whitlam really pioneered, I think, in the 1960s. So in his case, they did go together, but I don't think it's essential. And perhaps, you know, you would say with Albanese, who I think is doing a magnificent job in bringing people with him and being conciliatory, he's a very different politician from Whitlam. But I think the expansive nature of what he is setting out to achieve is not dissimilar, but the times call for a different sort of politics and a different sort of leader.
I think an important factor was the improvement in education in the Australian electorate too, because, you know, speaking for myself, you know, the first in my family to go on to secondary education, etc., etc. And that was happening very rapidly. So I think you had a much better educated, more sophisticated electorate that was developing and was looking for something with the capacity and the intelligence of Whitlam and able to enunciate so well Labor Party policy.
Yeah, I think that's right, Renata. I think one of the things that hasn't often been linked is exactly that point of education that was emerging at the time in the 70s. And if you look back to the 40s, after the war, the Returned Soldiers Education Scheme, which my own father was benefited from that, and, you know, like you, the first in his family to go to university, left school at 14, but having been in the war, was able to go to university after the war. And Melbourne University had that campus up in Mildura for returned services people, and had an education he'd never been able to dream of ever since he'd had to leave school. But then he was coming into his, you know, 30s, 40s, etc. in the 1970s, and it was a flowering of universities that I think we then saw in some of the experts also from that time period that were reaching their sort of zenith at the time Whitlam came in. And of course, the other huge shift within the Labor Party came with the massive increase in MPs in 1969. And I think nearly half of those new MPs, much younger MPs obviously, really shook up the existing members of the Federal Labor Party, Parliamentary Labor Party, And I think almost half of them had a tertiary, had been to university or to the advanced colleges. So again, a big shift in that makeup, both of the Labor Party caucus, but also in the Labor Party membership at that time, which Whitlam worked very, very hard and spearheaded with others again to make that change in the breadth of its appeal more broadly. Yeah.
Because I guess what inspired Gough Whitlam to be a democratic socialist rather than, say, a Menzian liberal?
Thank you. I'm repeating a question for the Zoom audience, which is about what inspired Whitlam to be a democratic socialist as opposed to a Menzian liberal. That is totally in his background. Totally. He was never anything, as he said to me many, many times. Anybody who understood my family would know I could never have been anything other than a Labor man. You know, it's not just the fact that his grandfather had been in prison and the family, you know, was of a very ordinary background. They were a background that succeeded because his father was able to gain an education. His father was brilliant, Fred Whitlam. He rose through the Attorney General's Department. He'd won a scholarship to Wesley. To Wesley. He'd been a public school boy. You know, he could not have gone on to study were it not for that. But even then, he couldn't. He topped the state, but he couldn't go on to university because the family couldn't afford it. So he worked in the Attorney General's Department and studied at night. He did law at night. And the family by then were deep Baptists. There's a strong religious background to Whitlam, not one that he continued himself, but certainly that he grew up with. And of course, his framework, his moral understandings are all deeply embedded in that. His father and his uncle tithed their income for their whole lives. You know, they were the most austere, well-read, internationally engaged people. And his father was an early member of Doc Everett's team that went across in the early formation of the became the United Nations and was later Australia's representative on one of the early United Nations human rights groupings. And so he was deeply embedded in that that notion of rights, believed strongly in the UN and its umbrella organisations. And John Menadue describes the time he saw Gough Whitlam at his most angry, and you know, you would have seen him angry many times because he had a fearsome temper. But he said soon after, or during the time that the Labor Party tried to expel him unsuccessfully in the late 60s, he said Whitlam was approached through a member of the Liberal Party in Queensland to try and bring him across to join the Liberal Party. And Whitlam was apparently utterly incensed, just furious that anybody could think he would betray the Labor Party and that his beliefs were up for sale. And Menadue says, I have never seen him so angry and disgusted. He was a Labor person through and through. Not only would he never have joined the Liberal Party, he would never join the Greens, which is the other thing that I hear a great deal of today. Gough Whitlam would be a Green. Gough Whitlam, you know, as he said, there are three great beliefs in the United Nations, the party system, the Parliament as the engine of change, and the great Australian Labor Party. And he, of all people, as I've tried to make clear today, would have said, of course the Labor Party today shouldn't be the same as the Labor Party 50 years ago, because it has to have contemporary relevance. And its first aim has to be to come into government. You cannot effect change if you don't first come into government. So that's my long spiel about why I feel he would not ever have been a Menzies liberal. He respected Menzies in many ways, but not for his political stance.
Look, thank you for this. I've enjoyed, and thank you for your work on the letters. Very grateful. My question is this: in Victoria, 1968 on, we had Rupert Hamer, a great contrast after Bolte, a language of quality of life, consumer affairs, all that. Have you given any thought to whether Hamer was, if not a precursor, perhaps a guinea pig for some of the changes that were able to be effected in 72 nationally.
You're right about Hamer. He was a very unusual liberal, a very decent, smaller liberal, the sort really that we associate more with the Teals today, because I think that arm of the Liberal Party has really been lost. And I, again, think that there's a risk for the Liberal Party that it's almost like a DLP element put upon the Liberal Party, that part of it is hived off. And if it can't reach out again to that broad base, it's at real risk. I think, yes, it coincided with some of those more socially oriented concerns that Hamer had. He was that classic, people often say, the Victorian sort of wits in the Liberal Party, but he was definitely, I think, the best example of that. But as I've tried to say today, so many of the things that Whitlam took into government actually had their early expression in his earliest days. He wrote, when he was a law student, for example, in the student magazine Blackacre, this most excoriating view of upper houses, the pretensions of upper houses, as he described it, something he carried through his entire view of the unrepresentative, what Keating later called the unrepresentative swill in the Senate, because of its, its undemocratic franchise and its capacity to override elected government in the House. But many of these things he expressed remarkably early, precocious, as you might expect. And so there is a continuum, I think, that actually goes much easier than that, much earlier than that. But he intersects at the end. I think by the end, when he had brought the Labor Party policy shift with him, the party was then the party for the time. The Labor Party was in tune with the way most people were thinking at that time, to get out of Vietnam, to end the White Australia policy, to liberalise divorce laws, despite the upheaval that was created in the media and in some sectional interests, that actually had majority support out in the electorate for the polls that were being done. And I think that's more what happened, that there was an intersection then with other areas of demanding change, including the social movements outside Parliament that were burgeoning at that time. Well, the women's electoral lobby and the expectations that they put forward at that election. So it's a much longer period of change for Whitlam and the Labor Party, but it has its antecedents even before that for Whitlam personally. Yeah.
Terry Moore, in 74 and 75, was a young secondee into Whitlam Government Minister's office in Parliament House. And the one thing that you haven't really mentioned is the failings in economic policy until Bill Hayden took over as Treasurer. The failings being under Frank Crean and most particularly under Jim Kearns. And you would remember that at one stage Whitlam was asked how all of these initiatives would be paid for, and he said inflation would take care of it. Not really. So that's the first point. The second point is, it's a question. Do you think Australia can now trust the monarchy to behave according to the conventions and not try and dabble in Australian politics with destructive consequences, such as those visited upon Whitlam?
That's a very good question. And I take your comment as well as something that's quite right. Whitlam and the Labor Party's agenda had been built on assumption of continuing growth and continuing plenty, as he said, it would be about the distribution of wealth and not how it was going to be created. And of course, economic conditions, as it seems to do for Labor Party governments, changed dramatically within the next 12 months with, I guess, stagflation, but also with the oil crisis and the skyrocketing OPEC prices at that time. You're quite right about the treasurers, and Whitlam was once asked later how he rated his three treasurers, and he said, I only had one treasurer, Bill Hayden. He was not at all positive about either of the previous two. But so your assessment is right. I think one of the interesting things that people have been looking at lately is there's always that comparison of Whitlam's economic circumstances with what came before. But if you look at what came after and see the Whitlam economic structures that to some extent they inherited and to others they developed, it's much more in line with what followed, but it's certainly not in line with what came before. So you could see it, I think, as a point of rupture in international economic circumstances that those shifts had happened in the full employment model and so on we had up until that point. But turning to the monarchy, my own view about their dabbling in political matters, despite their repeated claims that they do not and cannot, which is actually nonsense. They do, and when they do, they keep it secret ruthlessly. And the only reason we know when they do is either because of a lie act or High Court action to reveal letters from the National Archives, or because researchers find documents in the archives, as somebody in The Guardian has done recently. I think it's actually far more likely that they will. And I say that because Charles, our new, we woke up one morning and suddenly found we had a new monarch, King Charles III of Australia. Just what happened to the first two King Charleses of Australia, I don't know. But
something equivalent should happen to him, I think.
but of Australia, were the kings of Australia. But the reason I say that is because he already has a reputation, as you would know, as a meddling prince, and he was just unable to not intervene in political and cultural matters. And it doesn't matter whether you agree with his meddling or not. The point of a constitutional monarchy, and what they themselves insist, is that they never engage in political matters. And this is because they are not part of the electoral structure. There is no mandate for our unelected, dynastically determined monarch, and they are meant to stay out of political matters. Many of you may have heard of Prince Charles's spider letters, so-called because of his handwriting, in which it was a 10-year battle for the Guardian newspaper under FOI to have these released. Direct policy mainlining by Prince Charles into the Blair government over matters of policy like fox hunting that were his personal preferred options. So far from not meddling, Charles, with his interventions in architecture, his interventions in organic farming and so on, and as I say, your own position on that is not the issue. The issue is a structural one about what is a constitutional monarchy and how should it behave. I think the real problem there is whether Charles can actually change a habit of a lifetime for a man in his 70s and not continue that engagement. I think a lot will ride on that.
I don't think he will.
Yeah, I doubt it too. No, yeah. And he has a lifetime expectation and sense of entitlement that he always has,
yes.
Even knowing when he shouldn't have. So that's going to be the difficulty, I think, for the monarchy, and that would be very interesting to see how that plays out. Yes, was there any question here?
Yeah, please. Thanks for talking about this story, Martin. I was wondering what you thought would be the points of contemporary relevance that we've identified today, what suddenly appear in some.
Excellent questions today. What would the point of contemporary relevance be today? Well, one of them would have to be around matters of climate change. That's a matter that now overwhelmingly people are aware we need action on, and not just because the science is there, as we would hope people have recognised, but because we are all living with extreme climate conditions that have, through flood or bushfire or whatever, made that beyond question anymore. But I think the contemporary relevance is also being able to engage the community and have a much greater sense of involvement of the community in political matters. And that's one of the things that Whitlam really reached out to, was to give endless talks, endless branch meetings, endless community engagements, media engagements and so on, to sell the program. And it was vital to him that his notion of the mandate was that it wasn't just an electoral victory, it was an informed electoral victory. But no one could point later, as of course the opposition did, and claim that people didn't know what they were voting for in 1972 and 1974, when the program had been so clearly set out and so clearly enunciated to the electorate. I think Anthony Albanese has actually articulated a similar but much more low-key desire to engage people, to be inclusive. I think one of the really important ones we're looking at now is the voice, and I think that's a long, long overdue change. That's a wonderful opportunity to bring a broader approach to politics, and one that will greatly add the way the way our relationships internally work, and I certainly hope that succeeds. I think one of the other ones that will follow that, and Albanese has said it won't happen until the second term, is the question of a republic. But he's put that on the agenda. We have for the first time now an assistant minister for a republic, and I think the pathway to that is actually to embrace the voice and to welcome the voice as a change that then makes it almost inevitable that a shift away from the monarchy is fundamental and essential after that point. It makes sense. So there are three things, I think, big picture things that I think we need to make sure we embrace. Yes?
I just wanted to make a point that I was in the webinar yesterday at the Catherine Murphy was running around
Oh yes, so fascinating.
Quarterly essay in relation to Anthony Albanese. And it's really notable that you have spoken about Gough's background and how it's driven him from childhood and his experiences. And she spoke quite firmly around the same, is that Albanese was formed by his childhood, single parent. It's made him empathetic, strategic. It makes you think that we should have a vetting process, a different vetting process for Prime Ministers. This is what we're going to end up with.
Well, that's a fascinating reflection. Do we need to vet our voting figures? I hope the vetting process is the election. I'm a firm believer in the election process. But look, I'm a biographer. I've written 3 biographers. Of course, I love to look at their childhood. I love to find, Gough Whitlam's criminal grandfather. How exciting! But not just because it's an archival find, but because it actually is an explanatory find. And yeah, I could go on about that, but so many parts of his background, including the shift back to really strict baptism once his grandfather came out of jail, I now realise, makes sense. But they didn't until we understood that. He didn't even know about it. He had no idea. And all he was concerned, and his sister Frida were concerned about, was, did I think their father knew and hadn't told them? And that was actually a really poignant moment, because they were concerned that their father had this dark secret in the family they were ashamed of. But on the other hand, perhaps his father was completely unaware of it, because his own father came out of jail when he was only 22. So it's fascinating. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on Terry's first point? I'm going to leave the monarchy one aside because I could talk for hours about that. Essentially, one of the striking differences between Albo coming to power and Gough coming to power is that nobody in the Whitlam ministry had any experience at all of being in government. And a lot of the ministers clearly struggled. And I find it interesting. I buy all the achievements of Whitlam, but it is a cabinet government. And I think that a lot of the problems clearly go to the inexperience and I suspect lack of skill and ability of a lot of the ministries.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. Actually, 3 of them had been not in government, but of the previous, would have been Chifley government, but not in any major role. But yes, there was not immediate government experience. I think one of the good things that had happened that Whitlam had engineered was to have a shadow ministry, and that had been some years in place at that point, and that at least was intended to, and did, I think people like Tommy Wren and others who had the ministry as shadow ministers to develop an expertise to build up that knowledge that they could then bring into government was very clear. But the downside, and the one that he was, I think, tremendously irritated by, sought to change, couldn't change, and then was very badly served by, was the decision that all of the entire ministry would sit in cabinet. That had been a decision, I think, only in early 1972, and he had desperately wanted the Labor Party to adopt the Menzian approach of an inner and outer ministry, which would have made things so much more manageable and less frenetic. But he was overruled.
Can I add a point on that very issue? The difference between what Whitlam found when he came to government and what Anthony Albanese found when he came to government is that the public service in Whitlam's time was in a much better state.
Yeah.
Treasury, under Fred Wheeler, embraced the finance function and was capable of giving, as it did, strong advice, and Fred was always there trying to keep track of breakouts like the loans. And the problem now is that you could have a good public service from the end of 72, helping get ministers to work through issues, and Whitlam's willingness to set up quite a lot of relatively small statutory advisory bodies, which brought in a lot of people from outside with a lot of expertise. So he found ways, I'm not sure whether he thought of it in these terms, but he found ways to compensate for the lack of experience in the government. My recollection is that many of the ministers were conscious that they had no experience of executive government and therefore sought out advice both from public servants and from others. And it only fell apart in the case of Jim Cairns, Rex Connor, and in one sense, Frank Crean. Otherwise, some of the ministers, Tom Uren, you mentioned, fabulous, Bill Hayden, terrific. There were some really, really, really effective ministers in that government.
And I would say Lionel Murphy, the reform agenda.
Well, he's a different.
No, in terms of reform, not at all. Murphy's agenda for change through the Attorney General's Department was immense. So many of the things were actually driven through the Attorney General's Department, including Trade Practices Act, including, as you know, the no fault divorce, family law act, and so on, and taking France to court with New Zealand, taking them to the International Court of Justice over below ground testing in the Pacific. So some massive advances environmentally as well. But a lot of the Whitlam reforms actually came through AGs as well.
Absolutely.
But a different kettle of fish from the others. Anyway, we better stop.
We could go on and on.
We could. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Jenny. Please join me. We certainly could have kept going for at least another hour, I think, on this subject with this crowd. I'm going to approach Terry Moran and say, come and talk to us next year about the state of the public service. I think that'll be a fascinating lunch conversation. Thank you all. A really fantastic conversation on which to end our year of lunches. It's been so nice gathering with you all every month here. Just a few quick words from me and then I'll let you all go. We won't be having a lunch in January, we never do, but we should be back in February and we'll keep an eye on our communications to see who will be there at that lunch. The table in the corner here is now entirely filled with per capita staff, and there's even two missing. So we are a much bigger team than we were even a year ago, which is fantastic. I have often joked that I have very few skills other than recruitment. We have a fantastic team over here, and some that you may not have met. You've met before Matt Lloyd-Cape, but Matt's sort of went away and then came back again, but no, he had a long break, but he's now going to be running for us Centre for Equitable Housing, which will be launching, you're getting a sneak peek on this, will be launching in February next year. And that will be a new centre within Per Capita, particularly focused on housing inequality in this country, because we do believe it's the biggest driver of wealth inequality and it's the biggest reason that young people are extremely disillusioned with the state of electoral politics. So look forward for information about that. Also, I'd like to say thank you to Lucy Tyrrell, who's been our intern for the second half of this year from Monash. Keep an eye on that name. Lucy will be going places, I'm sure. And welcome Rebecca Connell, who's joined our team. And Rebecca will be producing lots of multimedia content. Well, she wouldn't call it that because she's a young person. But podcasts, TikToks, other information by which you can find out a bit more about what we're up to. So we'll be kicking that off in the new year as well. But my thanks to all of our team. John Falzon's here from Canberra today. We're having a bit of a staff celebration after this. Lucy Tonkin, who's our Andrew Harrington Fellow, Shirley Jackson, who runs the Centre for New Industry. Meredith Eldridge deserves a particular round of applause because she organises these luncheons for us every month, so thank you, Meredith. And I know Michael De Rosario and Sammy Griffith somewhere in the building, but I want to thank all my colleagues for all their support and hard work this year. I have had a difficult personal life over the last couple of years. It's all resolving itself now, but my team has been incredibly supportive. And all of you, it's been a delight to see you every month, and I look forward to seeing you all next year. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.